In 1962, Mikhail Gorbachev appeased to American demands during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This appeasement proved a critical turning point leading to the Third World War. Khrushchev and other Soviet leaders had not learned the lessons from France and Britain during the Second World War. The Soviets then appeased the United States and withdrew their missiles from Cuba. Within a few months, the United States invaded Cuba and set up its own puppet government. A year later, the United States invaded North Vietnam and initiated the Third World War. Had Khrushchev not given in to American demands, then the world had been spared 350 million dead. Oh wait, that never happened. The United States and the Soviet Union constantly appeased to each other and prevented a world war over the course of 46 odd years? Yet appeasement has become the pseudo-historical byword for the weakness of the British and French in confronting Germany prior to the Second World War. And according to the Cathedral, threats must be directly faced with a show of power because those threats will only respect force. But to anyone who has even a basic understanding of the Cold War and indeed the 19th and 20th centuries knows that this is patently false. The reality is that the National Socialist regime in Germany was wholly untrustworthy entity who lied constantly upon the international stage. And because of that untrustworthiness, the war between the Entente and Germany was not just assured, but absolutely justified. The simple fact is that after the Munich Conference, Germany was an aggressive nation which could not be trusted to make any deals whatsoever. Even after 75 years, the Nazis are known as the arch-enemy of the neoliberal world order and the embodiment of all evil. Yet I'm going to use an old term here. Stormfags constantly attempt to rehabilitate the National Socialist image. Whether you want to call them stormfags, Neet-Socs, the autistic right, or their own derogatory term for themselves, white nationalism 1.0. They keep doing this. They keep trying to rehabilitate Hitler and the Nazi Party, and they've been doing it since the 60s even, and it's led to nowhere. So 100 years from now, maybe Hitler will be seen in the same way we look at Napoleon, Genghis Khan, or Attila the Hun. But for the near term, all these attempts at trying to rehabilitate him and his lost cause is proved utterly pointless and an absolute waste of time. If you look at the rehabilitation of the Confederates, the lost cause narrative, they were losers, yes, but they were not aggressors, and they didn't commit massive amounts of war crimes, and they weren't bellicose liars before the war started. And much more importantly, the people who rehabilitated the Confederates were Southerners themselves. It wasn't Northerners that were rehabilitating the lost cause, it was Southerners for a Southern audience. When we look at Neet-Socs, we see that they're defending a foreign defeated enemy. To make it much worse, the National Socialist ideology is a German nationalist ideology. And to a certain extent, it's massively dated to the circumstances of the 1930s. When you look at, say, Maoist or anti-revisionist communists, that's a universal ideology. National Socialism is the dated nationalism of a foreign nation. Let's say the Germans are completely justified in everything they did during the Second World War and committed no war crimes and were the victims. How does that have anything to do with opposing mass immigration, forced assimilation, and affirmative action? The reason that Neet-Socs will give when you point this out to them is that the people will just call you Nazis' enemy anyway. But that's the same sort of logic as me being in middle school or high school playing little guy football, somebody on my team is being an asshole, or some guy on the other team calls me a faggot. So then I start yelling at him blue in the mouth how it's not wrong to be a faggot, or I even go and have anal sex myself and become a faggot. That's a non sequitur. That doesn't make any sense. But when you keep pursuing this and you follow George Lincoln Rockwell's legacy and William Luther Pierce's legacy of just pure idiotic nonsense of being a Neet-Soc, don't be surprised when you get constantly compared about it. And then waste fountains and fountains of ink trying to defend the undefendable. And going off tangent right here, the worst thing that they'll do, and the thing that really, really makes me roll my eyes, is when they try to make the Germans in World War II into the victims. And what they're doing is they're following this liberal, fallacious argument, this fallacy of victimhood conferring virtue. And that's the centerpiece of the liberal worldview, and it's part and parcel of a decadent society. And thus, it should be no surprise that when we look at a group of antisocial degenerates that are the majority of the stock of Neet-Socs, are we surprised that they're going to do the same liberal talking points of victims by the virtue of their victimhood are the virtuous and right side of every conflict? And like, this is where, like, their ideology and everything is just this emotional thing. And you see people like Heimlich, and I've seen other people online, like him, personal people, who literally will just flip sides because they change who the victim is. They're pro-white or whatever because they see white as a victim. Let's look at blacks. There's more blacks in the United States per capita in prison, and indeed more blacks are executed. So in a sense, to the world, and what we can see at every time and every day is there's more blacks in prison and more blacks that are being executed or put on death row or given life sentences, right? But that doesn't mean that they don't deserve to be in prison or to be executed. They're committing those crimes and they're receiving the punishments. And the way that they act in court is probably really, really bad and causes them to get worse, longer sentences, right? But the virtue of their victimhood doesn't eradicate the fact that they did these crimes in the first place. That the world sees them as victims doesn't negate that they did crimes, hurt other people. But the Neet-Socs are taking this exact same logic, that fallacious argument, and just applying it on top of the Germans. And they do this over and over and over again. Like, it's the same exact thing. Like, the virtue of victim is supposed to mean that we're supposed to abandon the entire criminal justice system so that there isn't a discontinuity in the one-to-one numbers of how many people are in prison based off their race. You know, the liberal worldview is we shouldn't go to war with, we shouldn't be bombing North Vietnam, or we shouldn't be bombing Afghanistan or something because we're killing civilians. But that doesn't negate the fact that North Vietnam is like committing a genocide against Catholics, and they're executing all these civilians with impunity, and they're doing all these horrible, horrible things. But the press is taking all these pictures of, a handful of dead Vietnamese that are destroyed in bombings, or a handful of dead Iraqis that are destroyed in bombings in Desert Storm or something, and the United States is a horrible aggressor regardless of what the enemy is doing, right? And the same thing with Syria. So say Assad's regime, right? Assad's regime's barrel bombing, and maybe they were actually gassing people, right? That doesn't change the fact that they're fighting ISIS, and ISIS is 1,000 times worse than Assad is. But because the barrel bombs are killing children, right? And we have videos of barrel bombs killing children, we gotta cry and destroy Assad, regardless of who he's fighting. Right? That's this logic of victim, and it doesn't lead anywhere. It leads to complete idiocy. So even if they had 100% historical, viable proof that the Holocaust didn't happen, to the extreme Holocaust revisionism, didn't happen whatsoever, and the Germans, in fact, committed no war crimes, and it turns out that the Soviets, this is just a truism. The Soviets used rape as a weapon of war, and the Western Allies bombed cities with impunity with the objective of killing as many German and Japanese civilians as possible, and Romanian civilians as well, and Hungarian civilians, as killing as many as possible. But that's not going to flip over why liberals are against Nazis. Just making them the victim isn't going to make liberals sympathize with them, because liberals already are sympathizing with their own victims. So you're really putting yourself in this situation where you're kowtowing to their worldview of weakness being a strength, and you're kowtowing to that, and you're not having any logical basis to your understanding of the world. So you're going to flip around like a leaf in the wind, right? A feather in the wind, being pushed around by your emotions, and you're going to abandon your Neet-Soc worldviews, and you're going to join Antifa, and you're going to be Michael Heimbach. That's what happens, right? It doesn't matter if you prove that. And who even cares, really? Because even if you prove all those things, the reality is the Germans were still the aggressors. Even if they committed no war crimes and the Allies committed all the war crimes, right? All the revisionism is true to the hilt. The absolute most extreme revisionism you can imagine. It doesn't matter at the end of the day because Germany was the one who started the war. Germany was lying through their teeth and Germany was the aggressor. Okay? What they're doing is they're following George Lincoln Rockwell. And you have to understand who George Lincoln Rockwell was through understanding somebody who's the mere reflection of him, but not in the political realm, but the religious realm. I'm talking about Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, right? The modern Satanism comes from Anton LaVey, and Anton LaVey directly plagiarized what Ayn Rand was saying in Objectivism. And her atheism, he just put, he made it ritualistic. He made ritualistic atheism and this huge philosophy of self-gratification, which is a literal copy and paste of what Ayn Rand believed. Rockwell is the exact same thing. He's a carny who's taking Nazism and the swastika, and he's getting attention. He's a carny that's getting attention the same way. At the exact same time, Anton LaVey was a carny that's getting attention. Anton LaVey is trying to argue against religion by being a Satanist, and it goes nowhere, right? He's a laughingstock. He's this juvenile rebellion, and it's the edginess of a 13-year-old. It's fuck you, mom, fuck you, dad, right? George Lincoln Rockwell is the exact same thing. He's going to protest up against segregation, right? He's going to protest against segregation by wearing a fucking swastika. And it's the juvenile rebellion of fuck you mom, fuck you dad, but now it's dressed up as a political movement. But it's not. It's just fuck you mom, fuck you dad. And that's all it was. So don't be surprised when this outlet of rebellion is hollow, stupid, full of idiots, and they keep going nowhere. It's nothing more and nothing less to them. Their entire lives, when they become Neet-Socs, are just a juvenile rebellion, which has led to nowhere and will continue to lead to nowhere. You're not going to save your white race by dressing up as a defeated enemy, by wearing his symbols as a costume the same way that a 13-year-old wears a pentagram and a goat head and a Baphomet as a costume. You're just saying, fuck you, mom, fuck you, dad. That's all you are, and that's all you'll ever be if you're a Neet-Soc.